think I probably came here about 1984, pretty much as a result of a trip I made to visit Sonoma County. We had a little extra time, so I drove up to see what was happening up here because I'd heard some rumors that things were really changing. It was very interesting to see the development of fine wine in Anderson Valley, and some of the flavors that you get out of the grape variety here is just simply amazing. You're certainly not going to find a wine from Anderson Valley that smells like Santa Barbara or Willamette Valley. These are unique wines, and they should be. That's why we spend so much time and effort trying to seek differences from region to region, because each region produces its own thing. If you like the Anderson Valley style, you're not going to be able to find that elsewhere. It's just not possible.
Definitely took it for granted growing up here. When I was old enough to take the school bus would drop me off here at the winery, and I spent a lot of time after school just playing here. It just was home to play in the vineyards and watch the seasons change and eat the grapes. I really loved growing up here.
The winery came to my family when I would have been, 10 years old, 1979. My sister and I have these memories that we would come to the winery here on the weekends. My parents would be in charge of working the sales room, and Amanda and I would be off building a tree fort in the redwoods and taking breaks going down to the Navarro River catching bullfrogs.
I got to Anderson Valley by accident when my folks bought a piece of property here in 1971. I was the one in the family that started spending summers up here and really fell in love with it. I ended up sort of taking over the vineyard operation.
Did you want to talk?
I'm not a talker.
Not
You're not a talker, yeah. My parents first came to the United States in the early 50s. My mom and dad were both waiter and waitresses and worked in some of the top restaurants in San Francisco. My dad got tired of it and decided he wanted to move back in the country, so he bought a ranch up here. I was 7 years old.
For whatever reason, I love crushing grapes. So I work in the crush pad. 3 years ago, my daughter, who also works in the crush pad, told me that I'm too slow, I have to get off the crush pad. And it's probably the only person in the world that could tell me that.
Finding a place to grow grapes and planting a vineyard, my dream. Ann and I drove in all directions for 2 months. Tony showed me this place. My intuition said, this is it.
That was in the Husch house, right?
I was so appreciative of you saying when you get a collection that someone wants you. I want to say welcome to everyone. I'm Lulu. I'm Milla Handley's daughter. It's funny that I'm starting because Handley was the youngest of the 3 wineries that are represented here, so these guys predate us. My mom studied enology in the 70s, one of the first women to graduate from that program, and they moved up the coast following her career and trying to get more and more rural.
I met Ted when I was a graduate student in literature at Berkeley, and I needed a summer job. I got a job writing press releases for Pacific Stereo, which was a chain of stores, which is why we had enough money to acquire some land. And in the 70s in Berkeley, there was a real back to the land movement. Our choice was getting away from demonstrations in the Vietnam War and cultivating a garden. But we also had enough business background that we wanted to make wine. We spent about 6 months looking for land, and then one day we had a great picnic on Greenwood Ridge with the fog coming in, and we came down the hill and
Came by this property, had a sign on it, got the realtor's name, went down to the realtor, and we drove an old beat up Mustang at that point in time, and we had long hair and sandals, and the head guy at the realtor turned around to his partner and said, 10 acres and a teepee, that's what they're going to buy, you take care of them. And that day we bought a 910-acre ranch. That person actually owns a Mercedes dealership in Beverly Hills, and he uses that what not to do with a customer.
Not, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't judge them by appearance.
Don't judge by appearance, right?
10 acres became 900 fast.
Right.
We didn't really care about being in country clubs and having those kind of perks. We really wanted to specialize in something no one else was specializing in, and being a big fish, a small fish in a big pond, and you can't get a much smaller pond than Dry Gewürztraminer in California.
We all started Lazy Creek in 1973, and it was 97 acres total. It had one of the oldest vineyards in the valley. My mom worked at Jack's Valley Store. My dad also did a little bit of commuting, working in the restaurant business in San Francisco, and then coming up here like 3 days on, 3 days off. They didn't have that much money because they didn't come from wealthy families or anything, because there's no income for 4 or 5 years. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going, and was able to start Lazy Creek Vineyards.
One of my very best friends when I was in the U.S. Army stationed in Germany was an interesting character. Mario started telling me stories about his dad and winemaking. I was totally obsessed. I just knew that I wanted to know something about winemaking. When I planted my grapes in 1971, my education in grape growing was nil. I was either the third or fourth new generation city people, trained, middle-class, wealthy urban people moving here to plant grapes in Anderson Valley. Number one, Dr. Edmeades, 1964. That became Edmeades Vineyards. Number two, Tony Husch. He arrives in 1968 and starts planting grapes, and that becomes Husch Vineyards. And then either Brad Wiley or Elizabeth Van Hoorn in Boonville.
We, along with 3 or 4 other families, came up to Mendocino County because a lot of those Santa Clara Valley farming families were in the same place. And so we landed in inland Mendocino in the 50s and said, okay, we know how to do pears. We planted pears. And we said, we know a little bit about grapes, so we'll start doing that. But we never had a winery. And so it was in the mid-70s when my family came back actually to Anderson Valley. We'd been here before, 2 generations prior as loggers, cutting down all the trees that we had to replant, Deborah. Don't mind that irony. And we bought a large property, no grapes, but we were interested in the pears and the apples at the Day Ranch right next door to Navarro these days. And then a couple of years later, when the Husches decided that they were done with the winery at Husch, my grandfather, who was friends with Tony Husch, they shook hands in the vineyard. And so in 1979, my family took over that business.
I didn't have any wine background, although it turned out that my great-grandfather had been in the wine business a long time ago, like in the 1880s. He was a salesperson for Inglenook and was responsible for introducing California wine on the East Coast, because mostly they drank French and other European wines at that time. Tony Husch planted grapes next to us. He owned the property adjacent, and that was in '72. He had planted Riesling, Merlot, and Cabernet up here at 1,400-foot elevation on the ridge. He didn't think those were varieties that he could ripen down on the valley floor where he had planted Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Gewürztraminer. And I'm sure he was right, because the Riesling and Merlot and Cab would not ripen down in the valley with so much fog and all the cold air settling down there. But we're above the fog here mostly.
A mixture of challenge and enthusiasm. The family certainly had a ton of experience growing grapes, and lots of experience farming in general. But making wine, that was a new skill for us to learn. The other big challenge is farming in Anderson Valley is different from farming in inland Mendocino. We grew different varietals here, and that was a new experience for the family.
What did you plant?
Gewürztraminer and Pinot Noir. We've tried various fermentation methods, and we found that traditional way of fermentation in ovals and letting it age early produces the wine that we like the most. At first, we tried to sell them wholesale, and then we realized that you couldn't really raise a family that way because you've got to be a traveling salesperson. So my background has been in retailing, and I said, right, let's open up a retail store. So we built a tasting room in '79. Our first vintage from estate-grown grapes was '78. And we were the first vineyard to plant Pinot Blanc, and we're planting more of it.
We ended up planting 20 acres of grapes altogether. It was the first year right at the house, around the house, the Pinot Noir, then up on our hill, we had the Gewurz and the Chardonnay. A lot of weekends, my parents averaged them to sell 10 to 20 cases a weekend. We usually didn't have enough wine to go to the next vintage. We would sell out before the next vintage would be released. Because we didn't advertise or anything like that. My dad was really big on once a year having a big dinner with all the tasting room employees from Anderson Valley. If anybody was asking for a winery or a tasting room they'd like to go to, they would pretty much hear from the other tasting rooms like, hey, you should go see Lazy Creek.
When we first started, she was making the wine in her basement. She had been making wine with Jed Steele Edmeades. Her last vintage there was '82, and her first vintage for Handley was '82. And she ran the business and made the wine. When my mom started making Chardonnay, it was unusual at the time, especially in the '80s. She was making a higher acid, lower oak. It was just different. And our Chardonnays were often not ripe when they were picked, but they weren't going to get any riper because the days were getting shorter, the rains were coming. It generally got really good Halloween costumes because my mom felt so guilty for being so absent from about like August, September till October, that then she would hand sew these costumes for us because I really didn't see her much. Like she would leave before I woke up and get home before I went to bed for that chunk of pre-harvest and harvest and crush time.
It was in the earliest days of Anderson Valley developing a culture for Riesling and Gewürztraminer. And the Gewürztraminers that Navarro was making were just so fascinating because they were so precise in terms of their varietal composition. The aromatics were undeniable. Gewürztraminer is a very tricky grape variety to grow because it ripens unevenly. You should be there at the moment that it's right to harvest. And Ted Bennett often was taking color photos with a Polaroid camera early in those early years, every single hour, and he would post them on a blackboard, and then eventually his staff would say, well, I think we're getting too much color, we should go and pick the fruit. I mean, it's a very unusual grape variety.
Gewürztraminer really was king back in those years. Not only was Husch growing Gewürztraminer, but the other neighboring vineyards and wineries were finding a lot of success with the varietal too. But as the grape growing region started to mature, we got formal. We went ahead and submitted our appellation papers. Our appellation, the Anderson Valley, was approved in 1983. And so we had our first vintages of white wines, our Chardonnays and our Gewürztraminers, 1983, showing that appellation, Anderson Valley, for the first time ever. And it was in 1984, just the year after, that Husch was selected to be presented at a White House state dinner. And when the phone rang, it was the White House calling, saying, we need your wine for a state dinner. He about jumped through the roof. He was so excited. The problem was they didn't understand where Anderson Valley was. The wine needed to be on Air Force One down at Santa Barbara, where Reagan's Ranch was, in, 8 hours. It was a very last-minute phone call. My grandfather realized he had to end that phone call very quickly to throw the wine in the back of his Volvo and hit the road to get it there. It did make it in time.
How many cases were sent over to China that first?
I think it was 8 cases, which is a pretty good sale.
So the Riesling was the first thing that we could get out on the market. So in 1980, we released our first commercial wine. So for a couple of years, we only had Riesling, and that was sort of what we got known for. We became sort of a Riesling specialist. So we did a 20-year retrospective of the off-dry Rieslings, and we did the few late harvest Rieslings that we did. And 10 years later, we did the 30-year retrospective and did 30 years, and those old Rieslings were tasting great.
We were still learning. My instincts were that, Pinot Noir is what should be here. Darren Edmeades and I and two other people, John Dash and another person, started a vineyard management company. We laid out that round hill of Gewürztraminer that Ted and Deborah planted in 1976. There was a little extra space on the north slope where he ran out of Gewürz, and I persuaded Ted to start planting Pinot Noir. That I said I believed that Pinot Noir was the future of Anderson Valley.
When Tony planted Pinot Noir in 1971 at the Knoll Block, it was the first Pinot Noir in the Anderson Valley. So when my grandfather came into the operation, one of his first objectives were to protect that field and make it a cornerstone of what we do at Husch, the Pinot Noir. And while here at Husch we made a ton of Gewürztraminer and got a lot of acclaim for it, we also had Pinot Noir and Chardonnay that we wanted to grow and to build. Pinot Noir in the Anderson Valley has this really fun history. We planted Pinot in the 70s because it was the only red grape we could figure out would work. But it was kind of the stepchild. No one really knew what to do with it, so it was economically valued less. A lot of records showing that most regions were removing Pinot Noir vines in that era. Yeah.
Was it sideways that
Yeah,
turned
this is the best
around?
Well, I think the turnaround for this region happened well before that. But sideways was, high octane gas and potatoes. Because ripe red fruit on the Anderson Valley floor hadn't really been seen yet after all of those experiments and failures. So it wasn't inspiration from the gods or anything like that. It was a really functional exploration. What can we plant that will grow and get ripe? And then we'll figure out the winemaking afterwards.
The Pinot Noirs here were always good, but there was one problem with them. Not for me. I mean, I love the wines from the beginning, but commercially speaking, this region always produced lighter styled wines in terms of their colors. The wines weren't particularly dark. And in that early time for Pinot Noir in this country, there were a lot of people who believed that the darker the colors, the better the wine. Well, of course, that is absolutely false. Pinot Noir deserves to be, in fact, it should be representative of what Mother Nature gives you from each region. So if you've got a region that produces dark color, good. But if you've got a region that produces light color, that's good also. The wines were absolutely perfect. They were like the wines of Côte de Beaune in France, not the Côte de Nuit. Côte de Nuit wines are not going to be produced here by average producers. The average producer here is going to make a wine that's lighter in color, incredibly aromatic and beautifully structured. That's the style of wine that you want to see from Anderson Valley.
I was our first outside salesman, so I would...
Much better than I was.
When I was pregnant with my kids, which was a good way to get a sale because people were so sympathetic to you carrying around all this wine. I think that was one of the things that I really liked about being a farmer is that you could combine your personal life with your business life, and you didn't have to make an absolute break between what you were doing for business and what you were doing for the family. We made grape juice very early because my son was allergic to milk. So I was just buying grape juice, commercial grape juice. And one day Ted said, "Why are you buying grape juice? There's 5,000 gallons." And we ended up bottling it, and we still love using it. But one of my stories about my kids is I, of course, had to have a babysitter, and I said, "Well, fill Aaron's bottle up, half with grape juice and half with water." I came home and the grape juice was there, and she had poured him half wine. And
They are very similar.
He slept well.
My mom was really excited when the Zuni Cafe, which is famous for their roast chicken, in their cookbook they paired our Pinot with that meal. So yeah, to me that's like whenever someone asks me for a wine pairing or something, I love that because it's really approachable. It's something we can all make. So I don't know. I got to eat a lot of good food. My mom was an amazing cook.
I want to do a shout out for Lulu of being a new mom and working because it is a real challenge. You have to have a really cooperative husband who
Yes.
helps with childcare, and you have to work at arranging your life, and there's just no other way to be in the wine business.
I know there's a story of Anderson Valley turning all to Pinot Noir, but we're trying to hold down. There's so much Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but we love making these Alsatian varieties.
I think all three of us agree, which the young, some of the newer wineries might not agree, is that we hate to see Gewürztriesling, Pinot Gris, Muscat disappear from the Anderson Valley. They may not now be the most profitable grapes to make, but they're what we can do really well that other places can't do. Ted and I have been in business 49 years now, which is hard to believe. And this last year, our kids have officially become the managers and owners. And Ted and I are trustees. So we have lots of suggestions, which sometimes they listen to and sometimes they don't.
Very hard to hand a winery down through the generations. And why is this important that a winery stays in a family? Because it is, it's becoming rarer and rarer. And I understand why. I understand why when wineries are ready to go to the next generation, they're often sold out of the family. And, maybe the label is preserved, but a larger company takes them on. So yeah, I'm really proud to be sitting with you guys, you two.
I'm really
Because it's not easy.
So I have two kids now. I have a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old, and it's been so cool watching my 3-year-old just grow up here. He totally gets, when the grapes are here and when they're gone, and he sees this. He's a part of it every day. He's obsessed with tractors and machines, and so the vineyard workers, he just thinks are the coolest people because they're the ones driving the tractors. So yeah, it was amazing for me for this to be my playground, and it's really cool to see my little ones here as well.
And we're not extremely profitable because we're not designed that way. But we don't want to have partners telling us what to do. And we've done things slowly, and it's frustrating, but then when you get through and you look back and say, oh, yeah, that's worked out. We're making decent wines, and we sell them, most of them directly. We know a lot of our customers, and it's very satisfying.
As a multi-generational family in the farming business, you learn to be respectful to the land because we want future generations to be able to farm successfully the way we have here. When I grew up and went off into the world, I had no interest in coming back to the wine world. But when you come to a certain age, maybe kind of miss that life in Mendocino County. And that's why I came back with my family, and I know that's why my sister came back with her family too.
Some of the newest wineries are making some really exciting wines that have such potential, and the future is just as bright as it could be because these family-owned wineries are still here and operated by the same people.
We have achieved a lot in 50 years. The fun part of grape growing and winemaking to me is you never stop learning. And that's the challenge. I love it.